Willard, who will introduce tonight's guest.
Hi, everyone. Neil said I could briefly introduce our guest of honor tonight, which I take as a challenge. Dave Zahl is the director, the chief, the person in charge of Mockingbird Ministries in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I write for Mockingbird. The chaplain at Rice University, who offices at Palmer, writes for Mockingbird, Sarah Condon. And Jane Grizzle, a new member at Palmer, writes for Mockingbird as well. Liz Parker, our associate rector, has a long history with the Mockingbird Ministries, and so there's a lot of connections there. But a lot of people ask me, how did I start writing for Mockingbird? How we get to know Mockingbird? And I don't read a lot of churchy things. I'm not a church employee, but Neil Willard, my husband, likes to send things my way sometimes when I have questions about things, or if I'm really kind of chewing on something in my faith life. And because he knows that if he tells me you're really going to like something that St. Paul wrote directly to me, and if someone tells me I'm going to like something, I am bound and determined not to like it. And so Neil was very careful when he sent me Mockingbird things, and he said, you may not like this, you might like it, but I liked it. And the first thing that Neil sent me was written by Dave Zahl, and it was called Seasonal Surveillance, and it was about the elf on the shelf. So we're about to start Advent and Christmas season, and it was all about all the things I was wrestling with about how we were going to celebrate Christmas with our family. And so you can look that up after tonight about seasonal surveillance. But what really speaks to me most about Mockingbird is that it is an echo of God's grace in the world around us. And it is people like Dave and people like Jane Grizzle and people like Sarah Condon who are writing about their own life experiences about God's grace in the world. And Dave wrote a great book that brings it all together for us. So Neil's going to ask some questions about the book, but we're so excited you're here, Dave. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. That means a lot.
It's going to take over.
All right. Dave, it's wonderful to have you as our guest tonight. And thank you so much. You have been really busy talking about this book that you wrote, Seculosity. I guess one thing is, have you been surprised at the number of conversations you've had? I mean, not even just in the United States, but.
It's been really gratifying. I mean, you write a book and you hope people will read it. But it feels like after a while, it felt like maybe I hit a nerve that went beyond my immediate circles and crossed over, you know, as you're mentioning a lot of traction in England and Europe, but also just, you know, not just in the Episcopal Church or not just in a geographical area. So that's been really gratifying. That's what you hope in a time where there's so many boundaries and things to maybe speak across those. So that's been the most exciting thing for me about it.
Now, this most recent book has a really, interesting and quirky title. It begins with the word seculosity. And I'm wondering, you know, what does that even mean and where did it come from? Which may be just another way of asking you, what's this book really about? And why did you feel a need to write this?
Well, the word, it is a risk to title a book with a word that doesn't exist. So, but I felt like I sort of wanted a fresh word to describe what it feels like to be alive in 2019, 2020. And the word seculosity is simply, it's a combination of secular and religiosity. So it was my way of getting at the way that we sort of, a lot of spiritual energy is directed at what we would consider to be non-spiritual targets. So like, I'd go to the grocery store and there was a lot of messaging about purity, you know, where else had I heard a lot about purity? Oh, church, you know, or you'd be at the gym and you'd hear a lot about transcendence and, almost like saving your deliverance, saving yourself and sweat and there was just a mixture, a lot of sort of religious language being used in these settings. So I wanted a word that described it without ascribing a sort of a divine aspect, because I think that there is a difference between part of what I'm arguing. You could say I'm saying that everyone's religious,
right?
And I do think that it depends on how you define religious, but I wanted to make some kind of demarcation between people that consciously confess sort of a belief a higher power versus those that just are religious about their Netflix or something like that. So seculosity was the term. And the other thing, Neil, was really to notice the mounting anxiety that I was sensing as just a person in the world, and trying to figure out, does that anxiety, the anxiety was starting to feel to me like religious anxiety. Because if you've been in church circles, and I was brought up in the church and seen all sides of the church, and you know that there's an anxiety that's peculiar to piety, to people who are religious. And that's what I was seeing. So it was just attempt to sort of take a risk and weave all these threads together.
There's a phrase, and you reminded me of it. I didn't actually write it down, but I keep thinking about it because I've seen it written down in other places about the problem isn't that we're not in church, it's that we're never not in church. And you don't mean in a religious sense, but people are looking for something and they're not shifting out of it. Or maybe you could describe what you meant by that phrase.
Sure. Well, again, it was born out of this feeling that that more and more settings, like the workplace, was starting to be for a lot of the, I work with students at the University of Virginia, and then they go on to jobs in various places, and a lot of my peers would describe workplaces that seem to be the arbiters of meaning for people, the source of community, of purpose, and all of a sudden it sounded a lot like church.
Right.
And even there were rituals that were taking place there that felt a little bit out of place, I guess. So yes, it was the sense in which, well, let me back up, because it's important to define what I mean by religion. And religion can be defined as kneeling and prayer and, incense and communion and God with capital G, or a religion can sort of be whatever you're relying on for purpose, meaning, community. And the words I use is enoughness, that everyone, which is kind of a translation of righteousness. Religions we tend to think of them as outlining a sense of righteousness. And that's a very religious word. But today, enoughness is a very, you'd ask people, do you struggle with not feeling righteous? And they'd say, no. What does that even mean? But if you say, do you struggle with feeling like you're not enough? You don't measure up to some standard of enoughness. That's very similar. And so your religion is that which you're relying on for enoughness. That's how I define it in the book. And in that case, in that sense, it was becoming increasingly clear to me as someone both living in the culture and observing the culture and writing about it, that we were increasingly leaning on everyday activities like parenting, dating, voting, whatever it may be, not just for the things themselves, but to get us a transcendent and a sense of enoughness and hope. And that to me, so that's what I meant by that phrase.
Now, and thinking about how seculosity kind of takes over the workplace, a lot of that's gone topsy-turvy during the pandemic. And in the chapter called The Seculosity of Work, you write in praise of blizzards, which is a wonderful phrase too, as a kind of modern day Sabbath, not freely chosen, I guess. And having lived in Minnesota before we moved to Texas, I completely understood what you were trying to describe when you wrote, in a proper blizzard, no one is getting any more work done, which means that no one is going to overtake us in whatever race we're running. They're snowed in too. Now, here in Houston, we don't get blizzards so much, but are there parallels to be drawn from a quarantine? And I'm not talking about how some clergy wax poetically about, that we're blessed to be in this kind of forced monasticism with ample time for self-reflection, because a lot of us have found ourselves working harder than overall through a combination of reinventing our jobs and supervising online school for kids. And you throw on top of that, not leaning on restaurants as much as we used to get through the week maybe. But maybe we are in fact giving up some other kind of race. Like, I don't know, like keeping the company house ready or making sure our suits are dry cleaned. I mean, is there something in there that we can find that are kind of parallels?
I think so. I think that's really astute, especially at the pandemic's been going on so long now that I think there's been several seasons of it for people. I know that's true for myself. in the first phase, for me, I felt like I could hear a collective sigh of relief as people canceled everything, which sometimes when we're really quick to cancel things, it's because we didn't really want to do them in the first place. For me, that involved canceling a lot of travel and getting to be with my family, and the grind of going into work, I know for a lot of people was a relief. As for some people, though, the initial phase was marked by panic and anxiety. But I think as time went on, there was a growing anxiety about feeling like you had put all of your eggs in that work basket. And now that you weren't at the office or weren't able to do your job in the way that you used to be able to do it, your whole sense of identity, your sense of enoughness was up for grabs. And I think that was deeply uncomfortable for people. It's disorienting. So at first it can be liberating, and then it turns into disorientation. So it's like a blizzard. If a blizzard goes on too long, people just start, I think they start to eat each other or something. I don't know. I've seen a lot of movies, like survival movies, but it's, that's the, I do see definitely some corollaries. But now, aren't we at the point where people are sort of like, what have you done with your COVID time? I loved at the beginning, there was a larger sense of, you don't have to maximize COVID. It's okay to be scared. There's sort of a grace given to people who were looking around and everyone was starting their novel, or losing weight or learning how to bake sourdough.
Right.
And then like 6 months later, people's like, I'm just trying not to be divorced, I'm just trying to survive.
Do you think that, and then after it goes on, like we sort of we get creative about kind of bringing seculosity back. I saw, for all the criticisms of social media, I saw a fascinating, serious conversation on Twitter about this, where people were saying, are you the kind of person, how do you deal with this? You wake up really early because you have kids, and do you kind of scoot over to your computer and send out a few work emails so that you look like you're really on top of things? Do you do that on purpose, or are you the kind of person that stays up late and you're watching TV and you send out a few emails, and is that rude because it sounds like you're insisting someone get back to you right away? And how do you read all these things, and what are the messages you're sending out? I mean, bring it all back, even though we're...
That's amazing. I think that there's a new book that came out 2 weeks ago by a journalist named Anne Helen Peterson. It's called Can't Even, and it's about burnout in the age of sort of a millennial burnout. And she talks about exactly this thing, how a lot of our technology is aimed at sort of performing work rather than actually working. So you have to like enough things and send out a few little, so that your boss knows that you're slacking off. And so you end up like worrying about looking like you're working more than actually working. And so it's a bit of a catch-22, but it also describes, I think, life in remote work land for many of us.
Well, and think about, there's kind of this variety of areas of life where you can, if you think you're not religious, you sort of take these things. And there's someone who's very dear to me and to my wife who's a deeply, deeply committed Christian. He's also an out gay man who doesn't, or hasn't in the past, not necessarily in the present, have a Christian community quite like Palmer, where LGBT people are part of every aspect of Pierre's life and leadership. And he seems to have found the greatest sense of community, the greatest sense of acceptance at CrossFit, where he's also a coach. So he's literally a part of the team there. And CrossFit, of course, is one of these kinds of exercise groups that can become a substitute religion for people for a lot of reasons. And I should even add about this person that he's actually been disappointed by the national leadership of CrossFit, but remain loyal to his local affiliate, his congregation, if you will. Mm-hmm. And it just makes me wonder, like, on the one hand, you can look at how some of these things don't always function well for people. Mm-hmm. But are there any positive things that Christian communities can learn from them, not to change the Christian message of grace and mercy, but to consider how that message is embodied and actually experienced in the real lives of real people? Does that make sense? I mean,
absolutely. I think that's really very astute. I speak as someone who is, my exercise group that I've gotten to be a part of has been a real saving grace during COVID, and unexpectedly. I wasn't looking for it. If anything, I'd written criticisms of that sort of thing before, and here God was having a mammoth laugh at my expense. Because the truth is, and as I'm sure your friend has experienced, as we all have, you can be part of an organization that talks about grace and acceptance, but doesn't actually, it's not operative in its culture. But you could also be part of an organization that talks about earning and sweat and go as hard as you can, the pain is gain and all this stuff, but in practice has an extremely gracious atmosphere.
Sure.
And it's kind of, when picking between the two, I'd usually go with the latter, because, and also, when you get to the church, you have all the baggage of 2,000 years of history, and, what the churches were like, where we grew up or whatnot. And that's a lot to take on. But I think that part of the critique of seculosity, and one of the things I have to do really intentionally in each chapter, and I don't know how effective it was to issue these disclaimers saying parenting is not bad, exercise is not bad, politics are not bad. These things actually are all they're great. It's just when we invest all of our hope in them that they set us up for, or we locate our enoughness in them. That's when you get the anxiety that ratchets up and the kind of hopelessness that you see. So I think people can have really healthy relationships with all these things. One of the reasons I tried to cover so many things is because I was hoping maybe if one didn't hit you, then another might. I was also trying to do the ones that I'm more that sort of hit me. But I think we go through phases where we can we're all sort of dynamic, right? And so we certain things mean more to us at different times. I mean, certainly if you're not a parent, that chapter is probably going to not be that interesting, but you are a child of someone, I suppose. But anyway, that's my attempt to answer that question, because I think you talk to a lot of people who would have a similar experience of something like, Soul Cycle, or today like it's Peloton.
Which is the one that I'm more familiar with Peloton, which is the one that has like the raised, platform, like an altar, like with candles and, where it looks like church.
That's Soul Cycle.
Okay. Soul Cycle. And
a lot of that's, intentional. These companies have consulted religious, there's spiritual consultants that are helping them leverage their brand, which is a very cynical enterprise, but that can be, I think, detached from how it's experienced.
Do you think, you mentioned about how things hit us in different times of life, and there's something that has appeared on the Mockingbird website in the past that I really have thought about a lot. I've talked about it in our men's Bible study at Palmer, and it's about the bell curve where, if you're I have to be careful how I say this, but if you and I are at a certain stage of life where we're at the height of comparison with our peers, maybe the height of disappointment about choices not made, or, you think about whatever, all that kind of stuff. Does that just make things all this worse in the middle of life, or?
Probably so. I think that, comparison is odious and all of that.
Right.
We're at the, someone told me that, your 40s are really about working and achieving and proving. And maybe for some people they're not, but for the majority of my peers, I see that as the time when you've finished your training, you're on that like second job or third job, and it's a time when you're expected to kind of, maximize your potential. And so that's an edict that can be very oppressive for people, I think, especially when you're surrounded by other people who are maybe from the same background, but doing a lot better or a lot worse. It's usually you're thinking about the ones that are doing better, but.
Right.
Yeah.
What about going back to, things we can learn from other, kind of adjacent groups or whatever, thinking about the example of AA and the recovery community. So Palmer has a strong connection to that community in several ways, including Archway Academy, it meets on our church campus. It's the largest high school in the United States that's specifically for adolescents in recovery from drug and alcohol abuse. There's PADAP, the Palmer Drug Abuse Program, which started at Palmer. It's where Carol Burnett's, one of her children, sought help. years ago. But lots and lots of churches, even small ones, host AA meetings in their basements. And those meetings often reflect the gospel more directly than what takes place upstairs, in the sense that in one setting, the mask comes off and a person is totally honest. And then in another setting, the outwardly religious one, the mask is put on, so to speak, even when to appear okay, even when a person is definitely not okay. And yet the church is supposed to be a hospital where it's okay for where those who are not okay are supposed to be drawn, where those who are carrying heavy burdens can lay them down. So how does that fit into your thinking, whether it's in this book or other writings that you've done?
I mean, it figures heavily. I think AA is in fact, in secularity, it's sort of the model of church that I put forward as a beautiful picture of what it looks like to have really run dry of a lot of your quests for self-salvation or asserting your enoughness through X, Y, or Z. You know, substance abuse is usually is what brings people there, but what keeps them there tends to be the fellowship, the connection to their higher power. The sense that if they didn't show up, they would die. You know, that there's a survival, a life and death part of that, which I, as a Christian, feel that that's equally true of church. But you're right. The temptation, especially in a culturally Christian environment, to put on a happy face or a Sunday face, it's sad. I think that you would get into that same kind of pretense in almost any institution. I think the church, because it's got a moral valence, is going to have a little bit more of that. But my ideal picture of church is a sort of a sinners anonymous, where there's no, everyone's level at the foot of the cross, and we're coming there with hands open. And that's why I think it's beautiful when, you know, we take communion and everyone's sort of on their knees, and you can be on your knees next to a 75-year-old captain of industry or a 15-year-old homeless person. You know, you're equal in that sense of having outstretched palms. So I find that to be, and a lot of, when you boil secularity down, most of the experience of secularity is some kind of ladder type mentality where there's a sense if you do better, if you work harder, if you just put you read every parenting book you can, then somehow your kids are going to turn out okay. And as we know, that's not necessarily true. But that's the promise, I think, of a lot of secularity. It's the promise of control. And yet the promise of AA, the promise of the church, is really the promise of deliverance, not control. So, salvation, to put too fine a point on it.
I used an example in a sermon a while back over the summer that kind of was an experience of what you just were describing, like church at its best. It was way back when I was bishop's clerk in the Diocese of Virginia. We were visiting St. John's Church in McLean. I was sitting in the back at the early service and didn't realize till kind of halfway through the service, when I was kneeling for the confession, that Colin Powell was across the aisle. But there was a real sense of like everyone in that room was equal at that moment. There was no hierarchy of everybody was the same, and it was a liberating kind of moment.
Absolutely, because in secularity, you want to level up all the time.
Right.
There's an anxiety that you're not measuring up to the person next to you, and social media, I think, amplifies that. But in the church, there's more of a humbling, but it's also humbling for the sake of love, and it's very beautiful when it works or when it's really evident, and it is very often. But sometimes it's not, as we know, where you feel like those are the good Christians,
right?
Those are the sort of Easter and Christmas Christians, or those are the, in some cases it's like those are the backsliders, or those are the second-class citizens. I don't know what it is, but right. I do see also the churches are the ones, if you go into the poorest neighborhoods in our country, their doors are open and full because they're welcoming people who've fallen off the ladder. And I think a lot of us are clinging on really tightly, and I know I am in certain ways. So I hope the church is the place that Jesus is the one who catches me when I fall off, or the church is the place you can go when you've got nowhere else to go. So
Right, rather than it being the place you avoid when you have an actual problem.
Yeah.
Walk to the door.
There was a great quote from Anne Helen Peterson talking about how being a sort of a middle-aged woman in her station on the East Coast as a writer, saying that she needed to, ask about her friends, remember her friends' kids' names and ask about them in the right way, and live in Montana in a nice house, but also Instagram that she loves enjoying, like living in Montana, while checking her email, while making sure that this person, and for many people, she just goes on in sort of a breathless, run of it. But for many people, I think Christianity becomes another source of ands rather than the place you go when the ands crush you. We were talking about this on the Mockingbird podcast last week, but I also think that the core message of Jesus is hard to ultimately obscure. You can obscure it for a little while, but if you actually read the text and if you actually get back to the Gospels, you see this man who welcomed those who weren't on the ladder and ate with the sinners, and forgave people.
Well, at the risk of shifting gears too much, because a lot of that's been heavy stuff. Anybody who's heard you speak or read some things that you've written for the Mockingbird website knows that you use a lot of pop culture and humor. You're speaking and you're writing, and that's in your book too. Even though you're writing about the deep anxiety that we're struggling with in the world that we live in, were you ever afraid that might trivialize, the important things you were trying to say, or how do you think that fits into what you're trying?
Yes, it's anytime. The worst, the criticism of the book that got most under my skin was that there were too many dad jokes. We could unpack the phrase dad joke and how pejorative it is in a lot of ways. That feels a little unfair, but I was trying to be, myself, and I also I'm trying to avoid being too cute while also not taking myself too seriously. That's the whole hope, is that because I'm a Christian, I feel like I can take suffering seriously, but not really myself, or I can take God seriously. So I believe that humor breaks down people's barriers most of the time. And you see this right now. Stand-up comedy is almost like preaching.
Right.
It's become more and more that way. And people are drawn to it because they want to laugh, but they really want to feel seen. And stand-up comedy in a lot of ways is truth-telling, but it's also like exposing sort of who that person is so that you can feel less alone. And so I think nothing does that better than humor. Pop culture, on the other hand, is just, I am a person that grew up absolutely steeped in pop culture. I worry that references to pop culture will date me, but it would be dishonest. It's the language. It's my shorthand. So a good editor, hopefully the editors made sure that I wasn't too heavy-handed in that stuff, while also acknowledging the fact that if you really want to reach people, most people watch TV, or stream Netflix. And that certainly I do. So I didn't want to put on a false front there, but also without being, again, too cute or what would the word be that people always use? Irreverent.
Right, sure. Now, the title of your book kind of, it hits on all these different categories that you explore about careers, parenting, technology, food, politics, and romance. But are there, a lot of things have happened since you wrote the book. Are there categories that you didn't put in there that you wish were in there? Or do you have any predictions about areas of life in which secularity as a cultural force is going to sort of evangelizing, so to speak, taking over?
Well, it's easy to say right now because we're in the middle of October before a presidential election, but I think that the religious weight of politics, or the space it occupies in people's lives on all sides of the divide, feels central in a way that it feels like divine, or it's invested with the entire meaning of life. And that doesn't, again, you say that and people think, well, that's a convenient way to dismiss political concerns, but it's actually just a way to actually, hold those political concerns a little more honestly, I think. or in ideally. But I do see a lot of that right now, and I don't know how. Maybe that's just our timing. I think the narratives that younger people are very drawn to right now are sort of totalizing narratives about history, and they're basically religious claims, and there's probably been there's a lot of good things about that, and then there's a lot of stuff that you feel like, wow, that sounds like fanatical. That sounds like you're heresy hunting. So I see that. The one thing I didn't write about, and I know in a Texas context, every time I've talked to people in Texas, they say, why didn't you write about sports? And again, you see that like we can do without a lot of things in our world, but we cannot do without the NBA, or we cannot do without college football. So for the paperback, I added a chapter on fandom, which for me, because I'm a television, comic book fan, and really a music fan. And I do talk about sports in that chapter, but I think sports, it can be this sort of vicarious redemption thing where like if my team wins, I win. And you can sort of project all of your anxieties onto a scapegoat and watch them battle it out and really take your pound of flesh. And you can play out these dramas of good and evil in a very, some would say healthy way. And clearly it gets very unhealthy for people too. But yeah, sports would be one. I think politics is ascendant. I still think that career is the most dominant form of seculosity. Especially with the young people, even the young people I know who are very activist centered and very conscientious young people, they still would give it all up to get a decent job. And maybe that's because of economic uncertainty. I don't quite know, but I know that anxiety around resumes is still pretty paramount for folks.
It's interesting you mentioned the sports. I'm not very much a sports guy, but there's actually a Texans player moved in just down the street from the rectory, Palmer's Rectory. So I've often wondered if maybe I should go talk to that guy, just because I'm not maybe it would be an occasion of grace for me to say hello to him, because I'm not a sports guy. He's going to make an appearance. His name's going to make an appearance in the next Mockingbird magazine. I was just told off camera.
Oh really? There you go.
That's going to be that's going to be a sports issue, right?
Yes, the sports issue. I'm interested to see where things head. I think Silicon Valley is a very interesting place that I think is extremely influential, and there's a lot of seculosity that goes on there that is only sort of filters down later. But you have a lot of Techno Utopianism is the term that people use, transhumanism, the kind of robotics. People are very worried and about robotics and AI. That's something I didn't really touch much of. I mentioned it a little bit, but if the science fiction that I ingest is any indication, then AI, I guess, is going to be a new religion. So watch out. But it's just not where I currently live.
Right. Well, thinking about, we were talking about politics, and that's weighing so heavily on the culture and on individual consciences and in families and that kind of thing. That's very heavy, and so it's not all these different strands don't weigh. And career is heavy too, but a lot of the others, they don't all weigh the same. So they're not. Some of them are more benign than others. Do you have any thoughts about that? How they're not all.
Yes, I mean,
I weigh on the scale the same way. People
ask me, it's like, well, what's the best one? And I'd say definitely food. Like, there's no question. Sure. If you're going to go with a secular religion, go with food, because at least you'll eat well. But even in that, you can get into environmental concerns that get very heavy, right? And health concerns that are very heavy. But I think generally speaking, there's some mirth around food, even if it's seen as the key to eternal life in some senses. So I think the book is not, because of the subject matter is sort of heavy, I didn't want to presume that. I also said romance. Romance is kind of I think romance delivers more of the actual transcendence than any of the other things outside of like really good, delicious food. Probably this side of the grave, romance is probably it also delivers a lot of the most pain too. So those are two that I hold up as that can be very light and fluffy, but can also be heavy.
The food one's an interesting one because I'm thinking of things like films like Babette's Feast, where there's something wonderful and joyful and grace-filled about even extravagance.
Yes.
And it's almost irrational, or it's not practical, or it kind of shatters some categories. And I just think that's kind of interesting. It's a little different than.
Yeah. I mean, didn't they say, isn't the stomach is the pathway to the heart for a lot of people?
Yeah.
And that's certainly true for me. And, but, when you get into a situation where meals are a drama of deprivation or indulgence and guilt, then you are in a religious realm. And I think food does function that way for people. So I don't want to dismiss very real. I mean, I live among a college community where disordered eating is a very real thing for people. So I don't want to make too much light of it, but I also know that people feel loved by being served real delicious food. And in fact, I mean, that can be a real, I think hospitality is like a spiritual gift. And so you never, again, you want to always qualify these things as saying there's something beautiful about every single one of them. But to me, if you're to rank them, I'd go probably food, romance, probably put technology at the very bottom, since it doesn't seem to really deliver almost anything but anxiety. But
well, okay, that brings up an interesting topic, because I happen to know, I feel like I heard you speak, it might have been at the Diocese of Texas Clergy Conference, about an experiment that you sort of tried to carry out yourself. I feel like you still had a flip phone at that time. You were very on purpose. Flip phones were not a thing, and you had a flip phone. How did that work out for you? And do you still have a flip phone? What was that all about?
I tell the story in the book that it did not work out. It turns out the world has moved on. And if you have a flip phone, you're just basically everyone's going to think that you're mad at them because you're responding with one-word texts all the time. And you're not going to have any idea how to get anywhere. And basically anyone under 25 will just you'll have no contact with whatsoever. So I tell the story at the beginning of the technology section about the phone being the invention of the telephone in Paris, and two painters at the time. The telephone rings and one of them runs and goes and picks it up, and he said, so let me get this straight. It rings and you go to answer it no matter what time or what you're doing. And he said, yes, of course, that's what I do. And he says, oh, that's just like how I ring for a servant. So who is serving who in the technological game is one of the questions I'm trying to ask in that chapter. And for me, the answer was that I was serving the phone rather than vice versa. And I know that our kind of digital hygiene is the way that it's being described now, or digital health. I think that's going to become an increasingly important public health topic in coming years, and I really look forward to that. I see signs of life in that regard, but for right now, I tried to get away from the smartphone, and it just what is the Godfather 3? They just keep drawing me back in. So I failed in that regard, and I'm still negotiating. That's a very much an open question in my own life.
It's interesting about technology. You have the power to set controls or limits, but we often don't do that. Use a really old example. When I was a college student at Wake Forest University, I went to go talk to one of my religion professors, and he was like, kind of like an Indiana Jones kind of guy, and biblical studies, archaeology, and all these wonderful books and all. And I walked into his office, and then he did something I'd never seen a human being do. He unplugged his phone, and I marveled at that, thinking I didn't know you were allowed to do that. Like, I thought it never occurred to me that was a choice. You had the option to do that.
Well, he's like that little thing that you pull.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
So as you've thought about these things, just like that experience, I mean, what have you learned yourself as you keep reflecting about this and speaking about it? What have you learned?
Well, one of the humbling experiences is that the book itself for me became an avenue of enoughness. I'm trying, immediately it comes out deconstructing all these phenomenons, and you can, self-awareness is not enough to deliver anyone, to save a person. And so I'm sitting there checking my statistics on Amazon and all this stuff, and it's never enough, no matter how many interviews or reviews you get. And so that's humbling. but it's also, I feel, if part of the book is maybe a confessional, you feel less alone. You watch as folks they don't feel like the book is standing over them, lecturing them, but it's sort of right down with them and saying this, me too. And so that's the lack of the, in a world that's so full of loneliness and isolation, that's been a beautiful thing to see. It's also, it's been a encouragement to my faith, frankly, because I can see clearly just how much what the gospel, the core Christian message really has to offer, how beautiful and unique and timeless it is, timely and timeless. So it sort of drives you to the foot of the cross, I guess you could say. The experience for me has done that. There's also been moments of self-righteousness or delusion, what have you. But those are a few things I've learned. And again, it's been a gratifying process, but it's also a roller coaster.
One of my favorite words is really important to Mockingbird and to your own reflections and all these different ways you do them. And it's the word grace. But a lot of people who are detached from Christianity, and quite frankly, a lot of people who go to church aren't really clear about what it means, or they think it works. And I guess there's a long history of debating how does it work, what is it? But how would you describe grace for all of those folks?
Well, one hackneyed way is undeserved favor. I think that's still a good one. Unconditional love is a good one. One-way love is how is a favorite euphemism for grace. But trying to get what is it that's beyond deserving? So much of our life is I deserve love for this reason, and I deserve compensation for this reason. So much of our life is dominated by that kind of deserving mentality, which call it scorekeeping, call it economic, transactional. I don't know what you want to call it, but the what is it that lies beyond deserving? And I think that's what grace is. Grace operates sort of beyond the bounds of what you deserve or don't deserve, and so it's hope in that respect for people who, many people, when you get underneath the skin, they all sort of think that they're just making it up as they go along, and they don't really deserve. They're afraid that they're the only one, or they're unsure of whether or not they quote unquote deserve love. And that's the thing about love. It's not really a matter of deserving. It's beyond deserving. You almost love someone in the middle of their lack of deservedness. That's what it means to feel loved, is in weakness and vulnerability and things like that. So those are some, but grace is, again, it's kind of an elastic word that means different things to different people, but I rarely see it used in a negative way. It seems, for some people it just means that it's, Roger Federer is graceful. But even that's positive. So,
and and describing sometimes our experiences in the world, there's a phrase that in one of Miroslav Volf's books about talking about a world stripped of grace. There are corners of the world where it feels like you can't find it, and it's merciless, and that kind of. I think about that too.
The other word for that is the internet.
Yeah.
Just kidding. Just joking. I'm sure there's lots of grace on the internet. I mean, I think Mockingbird is trying to do that, but Palmer, for crying out loud.
There's a couple of questions that have been submitted. One's from Jane Grizzle. How do we recognize something has flipped from, being good? It's sort of on these other channels, being good, but when it's flipped from just being good to being elevated to, a religion, or it gets this higher status, or it sort of takes over. Where does that line get crossed?
Well, there's sort of a non-answer to that, and it's sort of different for every person. But I have a strong feeling it's correlated to the anxiety you feel in relation to that object. There are times in our lives where we feel, it's interesting. You can meet people who are completely at ease in many situations, and then then you travel with them or something, and they go completely nuts, or in an airplane, or you can be with people who are just absolutely neurotic and high strung, and then someone dies and they become the most peaceful person and person in the room. So I do think it is a slightly dispositional thing, but in my mind, it's where the anxiety is particularly acute. There is such a thing as like free-floating anxiety, but it usually likes to affix itself to certain targets for certain times. So that's usually the clue. But again, I think something can be healthy and unhealthy at the same time for people.
Right. Well, yeah. So some people, I mean, you can have a group of people and they're experiencing the same thing, but for one person, it has become something else than for the, could that be true? I mean,
yeah. What is that? The preacher, Tim Keller, always says, what is the thing that if it were taken away, you couldn't live? You know, I think that's a good litmus test. As good as any. Is it, you know, Texas Longhorns? Is it, I don't know, Ben and Jerry's ice cream? Or is it the Senate? You know, I don't know what it is, but what's the one thing that if it were taken away, you feel like you couldn't live without? That's usually a pretty good thing for people to think about. It could be, you know, your marriage. I don't know, but anxiety. Where's that particularly acute when you even think about that question?
There's another question from another member of Palmer named Joe Adams. He is, his background's interesting. He is from Muleshoe, Texas. I have a ball cap in my office that says Muleshoe on it, and he played football for Dartmouth. Did I get that? I hope I got that right, Joe. And he says, in my family of origin and in my successive life, authenticity is very important, if not the most important ambition. You got to be who you is, because if you ain't who you is, then you is who you ain't. I'm told it's Jungian, but whatever, it's hard. Is it Christian?
I don't think there's a category for authenticity in the way that in Christianity in the way that we currently experience it. I think reality is sort of what people are talking about when they talk about authenticity: lack of pretense, lack of positioning or spin. And because there's a huge amount of anxiety about being your authentic self. That is if you're 22 years old and someone says, just be yourself, you say, well, I don't know who I am. What does that mean? Or what if your authentic self is, you know, not that great, or it's not who you'd want it to be? So there's a real, I think authenticity we respond to it when we meet someone who's authentic, but that invariably that person is not trying to be authentic. They just are authentic. So in fact, I think authenticity can be a trap that people, it kind of keeps you focused on yourself. And when we become fully ourselves, usually as we serve and kind of move outward, I think that's a more Christian idea of it. And who we are is kind of who God has told us we are, which are beloved children, forgiven sinners, however you want to put that. But when people hear that, sometimes I think, well, you're saying like, am I supposed to negate who I am? And that's not, I don't think that's what God wants for us. But I just know that term authenticity, it feels like sometime in the early 90s around the grunge movement, it changed from something that was like a positive goal into this mandate that became oppressive to a whole generation. And, you know, what was the worst thing you could be in 1992 was a sellout, because that was inauthentic. And today, you know, every single band in the world is selling their, you know, giving their music to car advertisements, and it's not seen as a big deal. So that kind of authenticity feels like a moving target and a little bit silly. But I also,
is it possible to have, I'm suddenly in the back of my mind, I'm thinking of a really uncomfortable scene that the Christian ethicist Stanley Hauerwas talks about. He's a native of Texas, I think son of a bricklayer. And he talks about when he was a young adult, being very authentic. and he and his dad had these, I mean, it was just like they came from different planets at that point, like whatever, politically, and what's important in life, what really matters. And his dad showed up at his door and had just spent an enormous amount of time creating something that was stunningly beautiful, philosophically objectionable to, I won't get into all the details, but, you know, the gift was refused. And it wasn't just refused, you know, Stanley Hauerwas was very authentic. And he, explained exactly why he could not receive this gift. And it ended up being more than just a rejection of the gift. It was a turning away of the Father. And, years later, reflecting on that, he said that was wrong to do. But, he was just filled with kind of self-righteous anger, really, looking at his dad, and regrets having done that. But maybe that's not the same thing as authenticity. But he was his 100% himself in that moment.
That's beautiful. I mean, yeah. So I don't want to suggest that trying to figure out who you are and what you like and what you actually interests you is a bad thing in any way.
Yeah.
And that's the process of growing up. I know that it can become a black hole of am I authentic enough now? And then you watch as Madison Avenue figures out how they can sell you authenticity through targeted Instagram ads. And so it's just a strange word that I think has really changed a lot in the way, because I used to think authenticity was the most important thing ever.
Sure.
And then then it becomes crippling.
Wow. For those of us who maybe push back at some of these ideas and we just can't help define ourselves in terms of our own achievements or some other kind of secular category, whichever one you want to pick. How would you talk to someone like that? What words of wisdom, advice, or comfort how would you speak to them?
That's a good question. I mean, if what someone's hearing is that your achievements are somehow not achievements, or should be something you'd be ashamed of or something, then I've really messed up, because that's not at all the community. A lot of our achievements are real gifts we've been given, and vocations and things, opportunities we've been given, and they're wonderful. I think, but with a lot of seculosity, my friend always says, fire and knives teach their own lessons. You don't have to I don't have to tell you, I can tell you the fire's hot, but it's going to tell you that the second you touch it. I think with a lot of these sort of seculosity things, eventually they'll take their pound of flesh. You don't have to there's no argument. You don't have to feel like I have to convince you that your achievements are going to leave you feeling a little hollow eventually that's just the testimony of every single person that's ever lived. So, and there's nothing sadder than someone who refuses to, retreat at some point, and holds on to power or holds on to influence far past the sell-by date. So that always makes me a little sad, though. I'll probably be one of those people. I don't know. I don't know what to say, except for that, see how it works out, and know that when the well runs dry, that God is full of mercy, and that there is a place to go.
Right.
And there's a
lot of people go once they've gotten burned, or they end up in that moment where, how is this working for me, or it's not fulfillment or something like that. Have you met people who were able to make that shift before that moment? I mean, that's when we're most open to listen, or most open to see, or most open to hear. But, of course, ideally, we would kind of discover some of these things ahead of that.
Yeah, I think God uses all sorts of things to draw people to church, to communion, to God. So I don't want to act like there's a formula you have to sort of bottom out on some project that you've got going, because there's always going to be a new project. And a lot of people who've been in the church forever, that you get drawn back over and over again. Just because you're in the church doesn't somehow exempt you from going through a lot of this stuff. I will say that I believe that failure, loss, defeat, humiliation, these things, incarceration, these things do have a more reliable success rate in terms of bringing people to belief. But all sorts of things, joy. I know that someone was telling me Stephen Colbert has a sign on his computer that says joy is the most infallible sign of God's existence, or something like that. So, and I remember talking to the poet Christian Wyman, who said the same thing, that cancer brought him to despair, but the experience of joy brought him to God. So there are all sorts of ways. Yeah.
I hadn't heard that from Christian Wyman before. So how did you enjoy talking to him? He's someone that I wish had been teaching at Yale Divinity School when I was there, and I think it's wonderful that he has a place to be like that, and hopefully have some influence. I'm curious about that.
I mean, Christian Wyman is about what does I say? There's no time for small talk whatsoever with that guy. He's the person you read in those, that he's incredibly precise with his language, and he's if you've lived through the kind of cancer that he's in, the near-death experiences, I don't think you have a lot of patience for just maybe pop culture humor, but he's a very gracious and deeply perceptive and kind of a bit of a genius in a way. So I wish I could sit at his feet too.
Well, tell us about some of your next projects. Do you have anything in the works, or are there other things you're thinking about these days?
Yeah, I'm thinking, you know what, I'm really, like everyone who's alive right now, the weight of antagonism is very real, psychic, spiritual weight. And I mean that by that, the divisions we experience, the us versus them, the polarization, the marginalization, the acrimony that just is out there, and it's like a cloud that covers, and maybe it comes from a life lived increasingly online, but I'm interested in what about Christianity can really unify people. And of course, you see, the divides, racial divides, you see gender divides, you see, those have been very pronounced, and the inequalities there the last few years, and the result has been, I think, a very helpful recalibration of saying, like, no, you don't understand this person's experience. But there's also, there are some universals about human experience that, you come from years of preaching sermons where you realize that if you hit the bass note, the low note that sort of trembles through, there are some things about being human that still seem to be unifying. And that's what I'm writing. The new book is going to be about that, and trying to find what is it that actually does bind us one to another, and how is that an engine of grace rather than judgment.
That's one. Now, how fast is that coming out? Is that coming out before November 3rd, or before the end of the pandemic, or when exactly this go up here?
5,000 words have been written, so unless I change my entire personality and work ethic, I will. But that's what I'm hoping to do.
And last word before Roger gives us a little preview of the next conversation we're going to have. There's a devotional coming out from Mockingbird too that some people might find interesting.
Yes, well, we have a new devotional coming out later this month, or next month, and our wonderful Carrie Willard has contributed quite a few devotions. It's a 365 devotion, and it's called Daily Grace, and it comes from, there's 70 different contributors in it, and all sorts of people. It sort of runs the gamut, and but it's scriptural, and it's a little 400 word encouragement for every single day, and I couldn't be more proud of it. It is really great, and I can't wait for Carrie to see it, but I can't wait for everyone to see it and own it. It'll be out very soon.
We'll keep an eye out for that. And thank you so much for a rich conversation tonight about these things that, they affect all of us in different ways. And we really appreciate that. And speaking of the joy that you mentioned, and what did you say Christian Wyman said? He said joy drove him to God, right?
Joy, the moments of joy that he couldn't account for.
Yeah.
It wasn't, pain is felt like pretty explanatory, but it was what he couldn't figure out was joy.
Well, I think joy is a perfect segue to Roger telling us about next webinar that we're going to have next month.
Well, I also want to just say thank you, David, for being a part of this tonight. And on behalf of the adult program at Palmer, our formation program, thank you for being a part of this. We've been looking forward to it. Yeah, you're very welcome.
I've heard such wonderful things about Palmer for years. I just want to say that. I'm a big fan from afar.
It's a special place. It is truly a special place. And we are excited to share that we are going to have on November the 18th at 6 p.m. because he wants to go to bed early. We have the Most Reverend Michael B. Curry, presiding bishop and primate of the Episcopal Church, will be joining us. That's a big deal. And so, David, thank you for being here to have him follow you. That'll be great.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Right. I'm playing with you. The opening act. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you, really. But he's going to be here 6 p.m. So go ahead and register. We have a limited number of spots. We have a lot of spots, but go ahead and register. That's on our website, palmerchurch.org. And David, I really was kidding you. I'm so glad you're here. I appreciate it.
Curry's incredible, so go for it.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. Maybe you'll join us. Maybe you'll sign in and hear him. So
there you go.
You're invited.
I'm honored. Yep.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. And this is recorded. And David, is that okay with you? Just making sure that we can share that.
Oh yeah, sure.
Excellent. I want to make sure that's so we'll put that just on our website, a little link to this recording. Thank you all so much, and have a great night.
God bless.
Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you.